Hey there, math students. Miss Smith here. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. Today we're going to be talking about absolute value. Now, depending on what version you have, your worksheet might look like this, or it might look like this. But either way, I want to start off by introducing absolute value. So turn that page over and find a blank piece of paper so that you have a blank side of your work to look at. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about absolute value today. Now, absolute value is what we call it when we see a number inside these two straight lines like that. This is also always called absolute value. These are your absolute value brackets. And what is absolute value? As far as a definition goes, absolute value is the distance from zero. The distance from the number zero. So let's go ahead and look at a number line and kind of see how this works. Okay. So we're talking about distance here. What if we had the absolute value of 3? Okay, that means we're trying to find the distance between 3 and 0. So our little Lego guy here is going to help us out today. Here's our little Lego guy. He's going to walk from 3 to 0. Okay, let's see how far it is. Boop, boop, boop. Oh, looks like that was 3 spaces, right? Okay, so the absolute value of 3 is going to be 3. Let's write that down. Okay, now we have something different here. This time it's the absolute value of -3. So let's let our little Lego guy help us out with that too. Okay, we're going to put him at -3 and we're going to walk into 0 again. Let's see how far it is. Boop, 2, 3. Okay, again, it was only 3 spaces. So the absolute value of -3 is also 3. Let's look at another one. What if we did the absolute value of -2? Okay, we're going to put him at 2. Let's walk him. 1, 2. Looks like the absolute value of -2 is 2. Are you guys seeing a pattern here? It looks like if you have the absolute value of a negative number, you're just going to make it into a positive number. Why do we do that? Because distance is always positive, right? So the absolute value of -100, if we had 100 on this number line and we walked our Lego guy the whole way, it would be 100 spaces. So the absolute value of -100 would just be 100. But what about the absolute value of +100? What do we need to make that? Well, think about if we had a +100 here and we walked 100 spaces, it would still just be 100. We don't need to add a negative or anything. So whatever number is inside those absolute value bars, you're just going to make it positive. If it's already positive, leave it positive. If it's negative, you're going to make it positive. Here's one more for us. What if we had the absolute value of 0? Sometimes that feels kind of weird. Okay, let's start him at 0. How many steps does he need to take to get to 0? 0, right? Because he's already there. So the absolute value of 0 is equal to 0. Okay, so that's your absolute value introduction. Go ahead and flip back over to that other page. Like I said, yours might look a little different than this, but all of the problems are exactly the same. I'm going to start with this middle section here, and then we're going to cover some problems up here, and then we'll cover some problems down here. So look with me at number 7. They ask you to find the absolute value of 21. Okay, well, we know to take whatever number is inside those absolute value bars and just make it positive. It looks like it's already positive, so we're going to leave it positive. So that's going to equal 21. Done. And here's where it gets just a little bit more complicated, so stay with me. What if we have the absolute value of negative, and then I said that wrong. What if we have the negative absolute value of 34? So the first thing we want to do here is figure out the absolute value itself. So I'm just going to cover up everything in front of it. So what's the absolute value of 34? It's 34, right? Okay, now that we have that figured out, we're going to add the negative to it. And so that's going to be -34. All right. Now that's a little bit different than this one. See here, the absolute value bars are on the outside of that negative sign. So here you're trying to find the absolute value of -34, which you know is just going to be a +34. So compare these two for a second and make sure you understand how if the negative is on the outside versus the negative is on the inside, that makes a big difference. Okay, let's go on to number 11 here. Okay, so in number 11, we have the absolute value of -19 minus the absolute value of -15. So now that we're doing a little bit of math with these, let's make sure we simplify our absolute values first and then do our operation. In other words, here, subtraction. So what is the absolute value of negative 19? 19, good. Okay, now I'm going to go over here. What's the absolute value of negative 15? 15, awesome. And then we're supposed to subtract these two, so I'm going to write my subtraction sign. And now we just have 19 minus 15, so that's going to be 4. Okay, so that's how this section works here. Now let's go up here. Now that we've had a little bit more practice figuring out the absolute value of all these numbers, let's just take a look at numbers 1 and 2 here. We're comparing the absolute value of these two numbers. So we need to translate them into regular numbers in our head before we can really evaluate which one is bigger and which one's smaller. So what is the absolute value of negative 5? It's 5. Good. Absolute value of negative 7 is 7. Excellent. Okay, now greater than, less than, equal to, we're going to do it like that. It's a less than because 5 is smaller than 7. Okay, now what about over here? A little bit different because they messed with where the negative is on this side, right? So absolute value of negative 5 is still 5. Now I'm going to cover up everything outside of the absolute value bars so I can just think, right? What is the absolute value of 7? 7. Now we're going to add that negative to it and we're going to get negative 7. Okay, now we can compare our two numbers. Which is bigger, 5 or negative 7? 5 is, so we're going to draw our sign that way. 5 is greater than 7. So that's how that one works. Just make sure you're thinking about what the number is before you try to compare the two numbers. Now let's go down here where we have equations with absolute value. And I wrote you a little note here. It says, isolate the absolute value first. And that is so important. You have to get the absolute value by itself before you can try to solve an equation with it. But let's start back to the beginning. In the instructions it says, find the two solutions of the equation if possible. Okay, so if you can solve these, there's going to be two solutions. But the if possible part should kind of give you a hint that sometimes you can't solve them, right? So let's see what's going on with this. Let's look at number 13. It says the absolute value of x equals 4. So let's think about it. How could we get the absolute value of something to equal 4? Well, the absolute value of 4 equals 4, right? We know that. Is the absolute value of anything else equal to 4? Yeah, the absolute value of negative 4 also equals 4, right? So we have these two different absolute values that both equal 4. So we need to put 4 and negative 4 as our answer. And this is how I'm going to write it. I'm just going to write it 4 or negative 4. You don't want to put the absolute value signs in your answer because the absolute value is already like around the x. Your answer should just represent what the x by itself is. So you're just going to put those two numbers, okay? All right, let's do another one. Absolute value of y equals negative 6. All right, so let's think about it. The absolute value of what number will give you negative 6? Well, wait a second. Absolute value is always positive because distance is always positive. You can't walk like -1 miles, right? That's impossible. So it's not possible to solve it. I want to just make sure you double check one thing though. Before you decide there's no solution, make sure that the absolute value is truly isolated. It has to be absolutely by itself before you decide no solution. If there was a negative in front of this or another number or something like that, you would want to get rid of that before you decide no solution. But in this case, the absolute value is by itself. It's set equal to a negative number, and that is going to mean no solution. Okay, let's do another one. Let's look down here at number 24. All right, this is a case where we can practice isolating our absolute value before we solve the equation. So if you're trying to get this by itself, it means you need to get rid of the 3, and I'll let you know how to do that. We're just going to subtract 3 from both sides like we would in any equation. So this is going to become 0, cancel out, and you're going to be left with absolute value of x is equal to 5 minus 3, which is 2. Okay, so now this is kind of the same process as we used up here, right? So the absolute value of what is going to give us 2? Well, the absolute value of 2 will give us 2, and the absolute value of negative 2 will give us 2. Okay, so both of those are solutions. You can write it with a comma or you can write it like 2 or negative 2. Either way, totally fine. Just make sure you're getting both answers. There is one situation where you're only going to have one answer. There's only one. Here, I'll make up a problem real quick for you. If it said 5 plus the absolute value of x equals 5. All right, so we want that by itself. Let's subtract our 5. That's going to go to 0, so we're left with absolute value of x equals 0. Okay, so what numbers could you put in there to make this true? Really, the only thing you can put in there is a 0. So in this case only, where the absolute value is set equal to 0, in that case you would just have one answer and it would be 0. But if you have absolute value equal to a positive number, you will have two answers. If you have absolute value equal to a negative number, you will have no answers. It'll just be no solution. We're going to do one more example. Number 25. Okay, it looks like we have 7 minus the absolute value of y equals 0. So let's get rid of that 7 because, as you know, we're trying to get the absolute value of y by itself. So subtract 7 from both sides, and we're left with minus or negative absolute value of y equals negative 7. All right, so it looks like we're seeing this equal to a negative number, right? So you might think, oh, it's no solution, but wait, because is this really by itself yet? It's not really by itself. It's still got a negative in front of it, and we need to get rid of that negative. So just like we would do with any variable, if it had a negative in front of it, let's divide by a negative 1. So we're dividing by negative 1 on both sides, and that's going to give us, here I'm running out of room, so I'll go over here. The negatives are going to cancel there, and you're left with the absolute value of y equals positive 7. Aha! Now this is something that we can answer. So our two answers would be 7 or negative 7. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.